is Villegas. I'm an academic at the School of Risk and Actuarial Studies at UNSW. I'm also associated to the Center of Excellence of Population Aging Research, CIPR. And that hints that I'm going to be talking about mortality, which is quite relevant to population aging. So I'm going to try to motivate what I'm going to talk about, then I'm going to talk a bit about the statistical or modeling framework underlying the package. Then I'm going to talk about the package and illustrate it using some mortality data for Australia, and then I'm going to conclude. But before we start, the way you pronounce the name of the package is StMoMo. So the first question is, do you know who is Momo? Any ideas? Okay, so I'm Colombian, and Momo is the king of the carnivals in several South American countries. So you see him there. And the carnivals are quite a lot of fun, so you see people having a great time, but they normally end with a funeral. So there is this character in the carnivals, which is Joselito Carnaval, and the carnivals end with him, and they end with a funeral where everyone is mourning his death. But the nice thing is that every year he rises again from the death, and then the carnivals start again. So now that you know where the names of the package come from, let's have a look at why it's important to consider mortality modeling. So over the past 50 to 60 years, mortality rates have been decreasing steadily. So you see on the left, like, that they have reduced quite significantly all around the world, and that has led to an increase in life expectancy. So you see, for instance, that in Australia, this is for females, then life expectancy in the 1950s was around 70 years, and now it's more than around 85. And there are other areas in the world where this increase has been even more dramatic. And this is very good news, but it also has important social and financial implications. And it has implications for governments in terms of how we design social security systems, even how we plan as a society as a whole. It has implications for insurance who are maybe selling life insurance or life annuities to cover pensions, and it also has implications for individuals as we plan and save for our retirement. So it's important to consider mortality trends and be able to project life expectancies. So in view of that, then demographers and actuaries have been very active in producing mortality models. So in 1992, Lee and Carter, they produced the very famous and groundbreaking model, which is the Lee-Carter model, which has, apart from that, it has spawned a huge literature around mortality modeling. So there have been extensions to that by adding more terms or adding cohort effects, and then actuaries have added more to the literature by adding some new models that they typically call the CBD models, which have a different structure but are closely related to the Lee-Carter model, and there are many more. So if you go, the literature is every day there is quite often there are new models coming up. So there are some mortality modeling tools in R. So there is the very good demography package by Hyman, which implements the Lee-Carter model and some of its extensions. There is also the ILC package by some people at Cass Business School, which implements the Lee-Carter model with cohorts, and they embed it in a Poisson framework. And there is also the life metrics functions, which were developed a while ago by people at JP Morgan, which implement some of the CBD extensions. However, there are some limitations with these packages. So on the one hand, they are not easily extendable to include new models. So you have a fixed set of models, and then you can just use them. And some of these packages don't have things for forecasting or simulating. You can only fit the models but not do any projections. And you cannot do very good goodness of field analysis, and you cannot allow for parameter uncertainty. So when I was doing a lot of my research, then I said, like, maybe I should do something to overcome these limitations. And that's where StMoMo came to life. So the package is on CRAN. You can install it as usual, and you can also follow the development in GitHub. So let me give a brief overview of how the package works. So the first thing that we're going to have is the framework of generalized age-period cohort mortality models. I'll talk about that a bit later. So think of that as an abstract representation of a mortality model. And that includes several of the models that have been proposed in the literature. So for instance, the Lee-Carter model and the CBD model, where you have a general case, which is the StMoMo object. Then once you create a model, then you can have some data and fit this model using this data. And then once you have the fitted model, then you can do things like plotting it, analyze the residuals, and then maybe do some plotting of these residuals. You can do forecasting of this model, you can simulate the model, and you can do some bootstrapping to do parameter uncertainty. And you can also simulate or plot that model. So now that we see the structure, let's try to look at what is the underlying statistical framework behind StMoMo. So to do that, there has been some very nice papers in the past 3-4 years which sort of formulated a unifying framework for a lot of the mortality models. And the basic idea is that you can have a generalized HP cohort model structure, which I explained shortly, and that can be related to generalized linear and non-linear models. And hence, since you can relate it to generalized linear or non-linear models, then we can use in R the packages existing for that. So we can, in fact, in the implementation, I relied a lot on the GNM package by Heather Turner, and for the forecasting part of the model and simulation on the forecast package by Hyman. So let's have a look at how is the generalized HP cohort model structure. So this is Australian mortality rates. This is in a log scale. So this is in 1921. So you see here by age, the log of the mortality, and then you see like birth, the mortality is quite high, then it declines, and then it starts to increase again when you're in your when you're in your teen age, and then it increases. But let's see how it evolves in time. So it has been decreasing, so you see that as time goes by, these mortality rates have been decreasing. You see that it has decreased more at some ages and less at other ages. And then what we have maybe now in 2014, which is the latest available data, we have something like this. So basically what mortality models want to achieve is model this evolution of mortality rates. So how do they do it? So normally they have the log of the mortality rate or the log of the force of mortality, and it will be depend on age and time. And then you will have an age effect or a static part, which will be the alpha x, which just captures this general shape. So the fact that mortality decreases when you are younger, and then it goes up, and then it increases more or less linearly. Then you have a kappa-t term that captures this decreasing time. But this decreasing time is not the same for all ages. Therefore, you have a beta x that modulates that effect. And this is pretty much the famous Lee-Carter model. And then people have gone to extend this, for instance, by adding more age period terms. So not only having one beta x kappa t, but more than one, or 5, 6, or whatever. And there are also some effects that follow someone as they age, that depend on the birth cohort. So in the animation, it would have been seen like something following along these diagonals. And that would be a cohort effect, which will depend on t minus x, which is the time where you were born. And then these models could also be modulated by age. So a lot of the models will fit within this framework. So now that you have that, we are going to use an analogy with generalized linear models to be able to define a general abstraction for how you capture an stochastic mortality model. So normally what you have in your data, it's deaths and exposures, and you want to model your deaths either using a Poisson distribution or a binomial distribution. So that's the random component. That's the normal thing that we have in a generalized linear model. Then you have the systematic component, which is how you model like the shape of this evolution. And that will have the shape or the structure that I just showed you before, this generalized H-period cohort structure. And then there are two cases typically in this type of structures, and that will be related to how you estimate these beta x terms. So normally, this beta x will be either non-parametric or that you estimate from the data, and this will be the Lee-Carter type models. Or there will be some models where this beta x is just fixed. You just give it before you do the fitting, right? And then you will have a link function linking the random component and the systematic component. And normally you would use a log link if you're in a Poisson setting, or a logit binomial if you are, or a logit if you're in a binomial setting. And then there will be a fourth part, which is the thing that is additional to the traditional generalized linear models, which will be a set of parameter constraints. So a lot of these models are over-parametrized, so you cannot estimate the parameters uniquely. So you need to define a way of finding a unique set of parameter estimates. And you can do that by having a transformation function or a constraint function that takes an estimated set of parameters and then transforms them into something that satisfies the constraints you want. This is the more complicated bit, but we'll see that is not as hard. So in StMoMo, then the interface just captures this analogy. So you use the StMoMo function to define a new abstract generalized H-period cohort model. So it will have a link argument, which will tell you whether you're using a logit binomial setting or a log Poisson setting. And then we need to define the predictor or the systematic component. And for that, we will follow this GAPC approach. So you will have an static H function, which would be either true or false, where you have this term there. And then you will have the period H components, which will define these. So it will say whether they are something that you estimate or they are predefined. And then you will also have a cohort H function, which will tell you how this part of the model behaves. And then you will have the more complicated part, which will be the constraint functions, which you may need to use in some models. So let's see that with some examples. So these are just 4 models that are very popular. So one is the Lee-Carter model, which will have this predictor structure. You have the APC model, that if you come from medical science or sociology, you will be probably familiar with that. And then you have the CBD model, which will model the log of the force of mortality as a linear function of age that just varies with time. And then you have some extensions of that, which would include a quadratic H term and then a cohort effect. And let's assume that we're going to fit all the models using a log Poisson setting. So let's see how we will define a Lee-Carter model. So in a Lee-Carter model, what we have is this sort of predictor, and typically people would impose these 2 constraints. You need these constraints because you can transform the parameters and get exactly the same estimation of the death rates. So for instance, if you take the beta x and multiply it by c, then you can divide the kappa t by c, and you get exactly the same thing on the left side. So people will normally impose these sort of constraints, that they will do it like this. Let's forget about it, but let's see how you would do it in StMoMo. So let's go to the bottom part. So you will say, I'm using a log Poisson setting, so I just say the link is log. Then this model does have an alpha x, so I say it's true. And the period H function is something that I want to estimate from the data, so I just say it's non-parametric. And then I need to provide a function to impose the constraints. And in this case, I know that if I want my constraints to satisfy this, I can just do this transformation. So I just write that plainly in R as a function, which I provide. Now let's see another model, which is even easier. So in the CBD model, the predictor structure looks like this, and this model is identifiable. You don't need any constraints. So if you want to define it, then the only thing you need to do is define this F2 function, which would define this x minus x bar, and then you will say, my model is going to be a log Poisson model. It doesn't have an alpha x, so this is false, and then the kappa 1 is multiplied by a 1, so it's a 1, and the kappa 2 is multiplied by F2. So I have set up my model. Now, there are many models that are very common, so there are already some predefined functions for fitting them. So you can just use those for the existing models. And then it just defines the model, and in the back of StMoMo, what is a definition of a GNM formula for the estimation of the model. So now let's see how it works with some data. So you can get some data for Australia, for Australian mortality. You can get that from the human mortality database. And in the demography package, there is a function that directly connects to the database, and you just need to create a username and password. So we get their data for Australia from 1921 to 2014, and that looks like this. So, and we want to model that. So now let's see how we model it. So some of these models are only used for older ages, because actuaries are typically interested in mortality after age 50, 55, because they're interested in pensions. So in this case, let's say that we're going to fit our models to that data. We just need to transform it to some data that StMoMo can read. We said that we're going to fit it from age 55 to age 89, and says that we just want to use the most recent data from 1970. So to fit the model, we just say, I want to fit the Lee-Carter model. My data is the Australian male data, and these are the ages and years that I want to fit, and you can do that for any of the models, right? Once you fit the model, then you can plot it. So here is a plot of the Lee-Carter model. So let me pause here to explain what the parameters represent. So the alpha x will be the shape, the general shape. You saw before that after age 50, mortality behaved quite linearly in the log scale. The kappa t is the decline in mortality, and you see that it's quite linear. And that's very useful for forecasting, because you can just forecast this linear trend. And then this beta x will tell you at which ages mortality has improved faster. So you see that around age 60, 65, the improvement has been higher than at around age 85. Right. So once you fit the models, you want to analyze the residuals. And for that, you can just compute the residuals. That's pretty straightforward. And most actuaries, what they they don't do a very formal analysis of the fit of the model, but they use just some exploratory analysis of the residual plots. So here you have residual plots by age, by calendar year and age, and basically a good model should have something that looks random. And in this case, you see that the Lee-Carter model sort of have some concentrations, the CBD model also have some concentrations of residuals, so perhaps the M7 model is a good one. I'm not going to go into the details of which model you should use, but say from this one, say an M7 model is good. Once you fit the model, then you want to use this for forecasting and simulating mortality rates. The only things that you need to forecast and simulate in this type of setting are the things that depend on time. So this would be the kappa t's, which will normally assume that they follow a multivariate random walk with drift, and then the cohort effects, which we normally assume that they follow a general ARIMA model. So for the models that have an APC, a cohort effect, we have chosen some specific ARIMA models. You can choose that, say, using the auto ARIMA function in R, or you can do a more proper analysis, but in this case, assume that this works. So if you want to forecast, so say we're going to obtain forecast of mortality for Australia for the next 50 years, so we can do it, say, with the Lee-Carter model, we have already fitted it. We want to obtain a forecast for the next 50 years, and then we have the forecast here. For the models that have a cohort effect, we also need to define what model we're using for the cohort effect. And then we can obtain a projection of the model. So this is for the M7 model, which had more kappa t terms. So you see a projection, and you also get some parameter uncertainty, some prediction intervals around it. And then with that, you can also do simulations because you may be interested to get some S scenarios, some possible S scenarios of future mortality. So you can do that in a pretty similar way, but in this case, you use the simulate function and you tell the package how many simulations you want. And with that, you can, for instance, simulate the period indexes, and based on the period indexes, you can then, say, produce some fine charts of what the prediction might look like, and then you can translate that into projections for different death rates. So in this case, I show here the projections of death rates at different ages using the different models. So you see how, say, mortality has been declining significantly at all ages in Australia, and then all the models project that it's going to keep decreasing. Some project a faster decrease than others, and some project a wider uncertainty. So when doing this type of model, it's important to consider different models so that you can get different view on model risk. And you can do some bootstrapping. So for doing that, you just apply the bootstrap function that applies just some semi-parametric and residual bootstrapping techniques. And that's all you can do with the package. So let me try to summarize what we have done. So we use the framework of GLMs to define an abstract way of defining stochastic mortality models using the GAPC family of models. And that allows us to leverage on the powerful GNM package to provide some functions for fitting the models. And the package that we developed allows you to do model fitting, doing goodness of fit, doing projection, simulation, bootstrapping, and parameter uncertainty. And it makes an easy implementation of a range of models, and it makes a useful addition for actuaries using longevity risk analysis. The package has been out for about 2 years, and now so a lot of people, several people from different insurance companies and insurance supervisors are using it. And it also is very useful in the classroom because you can teach your students how to use these models without having to go to the painful process of implementing all the estimation techniques. So now to finish, another question. So do you know where is Momo? Okay. So Momo is just across the river. It's just 20 minutes walk. It's just a barbecue chicken shop. And I went there last November, and it's okay. But so thank you. If you're interested, just write to me. Any questions? Yeah, Metin? Thanks. Sorry? Yes. So actually, a lot of the package is mainly a wrapper for GNM. So basically, what the package does is it interprets what the user provides and creates this predictor structure. And then underlying that is just some parsing to create a GNM formula, which is similar to a GLM formula. And then based on that, you can do the fitting. And then a lot of the work then is how to recover the parameters from the GLM in a way that it's easy for the user to read, but it's not a lot of work in terms of fitting, except for one model which is a bit strange. But apart from that, it's very straightforward. Yep. It's a type of? Yes. In fact, if I were given this talk in Sydney, there is a place in Newtown which is called Little Momo, and it's a dumpling place.